it is a tremendous honor for me to welcome Mr. Tom Campbell.
Sorry, we've gotten off to a bit of a late start, but we had more people than we thought, and they just kept coming. And hopefully everybody's got a seat or someplace they're going to be able to be comfortable for approximately 3 hours. We will take a break somewhere in the middle. This is primarily not to be me lecturing you. This is primarily to be a question and answer. So hopefully you will have lots of questions. But I will start it with a little bit of background, a little bit of a summary of who I am and how I ended up, I should say this way, how a nice physicist like me ended up, in a place of studying consciousness and publishing books on consciousness. That's not a pairing that often happens. So that's sort of a unique position that I'm in. I started my career, if you'll say, in physics and in conscious research at about the same time, early 1970s. I was 20-something, just out of graduate school, and my first job as a professional physicist, my boss showed me a book, Journeys Out of the Body by Bob Monroe. And he asked me what I thought about it. And I read the book. And when your boss asks you what you think about it, you got to be careful how you answer. So I read it, and what I told him was that it sure was interesting. And if it was true, that was exciting, because it would mean that there was another whole set of reality that I didn't know much about. But how do you know if it's true? How do you know that he's not just making up stories? How do you know it's not just to sell books? How do you know he didn't just dream this all up? So that's kind of where we rested. My boss kind of agreed with that. Yeah, it really was interesting, but how do you know? Well, it wasn't more than a couple of months after that my boss found where Bob Monroe lived. It was only about a 45-minute drive from where we lived. So we made an arrangement to go see Bob Monroe. I don't know if you know Bob Monroe, but he wrote not only Journeys Out of the Body, but then he wrote Far Journeys and then Ultimate Journeys. Those are probably published in 30 different languages. They're, come on in.
Bring your own chair.
Bring your own chair, yeah. It's your challenge is to find a place to put it. You can just put it right over here if you want. That's fine. Okay. So it's a well-known book. It's been read by many hundreds of thousands of people. And when I met Bob, I realized he wasn't writing that book because he wanted to make money. When you got to his manor house, it was the big house on the hill where you do about a half-a-mile run along the whiteboard fence with the horses inside to follow along the car on the other side of the fence. About 500 acres of prime Virginia mountains and farmland. So he wasn't making these books for money. He was already a very wealthy man. And I found out that what he wanted to do is study consciousness. That was his ambition. He wanted to make his out-of-body experiences real. He wanted to make it science. So he had set up a lab and was looking for a couple of scientists to help him turn his experience into science. And there I happened to be sitting on his doorstep at that time. So myself and another fellow from where I worked, Dennis Menerick, we agreed. And we said, Bob, we will be your scientists, no charge, if you teach us what you know about out-of-body. If you can teach us to have these experiences. And that was our deal, because we knew that if we didn't experience it, it wouldn't be real to us. You can study somebody else, but it's just studying somebody else. And you never really know what they mean or how seriously you ought to take it, because it's somebody else. So he agreed. And for the next probably 7 or 8 years, Dennis and I spent 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe in his lab. And within probably the first 6 months or a year, he was successful at teaching us how to do what he did. So we learned to, on demand, whenever we wanted to, go out of body. Now, first I have to tell you, out of body is a very poor term. You're not in your body, and it's not something that goes out of your body. That's a mistaken metaphor. It's becoming aware, conscious and operative within consciousness. This is exploration of inner space, as opposed to the exploration of outer space that we spend billions of dollars on. This exploration of inner space is free, except for the time that it costs you and the effort that it costs you. So it was about the exploration of inner space, about exploring consciousness. Probably 100 years ago, people studied this phenomena, and they called it astral projection, because they believed they projected their soul out of their body into an astral plane. But these were all beliefs and metaphors. Bob is the one that made up the out-of-body experience, and OOBE, O-O-B-E, because he didn't like all the emotional and theoretical stuff that went along with astral projection, so he made up his own term so he didn't have to be associated with that. So anyway, I learned to do that, and as a physicist, my goal in life, what I do, is that I try to understand reality, how it works. Why does it work that way? What can you do in this world of consciousness? What can't you do there? What are the limits, and why are there limits? What are the limits from? So that was what my mission was. And I was the only physicist on the team. Dennis was an electrical engineer. So I wanted to understand the theory behind it. Why did it work? It took me a long time. I'm a slow learner. It took me a very long time. But I was able to figure it out because I was able to do experiments in the non-physical. Once you can leave this reality frame, go into that consciousness reality, that out-of-body reality, if we continue to use that term. When you can do that at will and do it many, many hundreds and hundreds of times, you get to where you can repeat your experiences very precisely. In other words, you can get into the same altered state in exactly the same way with the exactly same kind of entrance, same kind of attitude, same sort of everything, so that you can actually do science there. You can hold all the variables still except one. So you repeat it the same way and you let one variable be loose. And then you change that variable and see how does it change your result. And then you change it again and see how does it change your result. And you do that 100 times until you have some idea what this variable has to do with this system and how the system works and what its limitations are. So I did that, and it took me another 35 years before I thought I understood it well enough to write it down. Somebody challenged me, and I'd been talking about it, and somebody challenged me, says, well, how does all this work? What's the big picture here? And I had a lot of pieces of it, but I didn't really have a good overall theory yet. So I decided that I'd write it down, because I found that you can think in your mind, you think you understand something, but some of your thinking can be pretty fuzzy. Sometimes you have these assumptions inside and you just kind of slide over them without really being too critical, and that when you write it down, it forces you to clarity. It forces you to say exactly what you mean and mean exactly what you say, when in casual conversation, we tend to be kind of fuzzy in our concepts and in the things we say. So that was the beginning of the book, and eventually I said, wow, maybe I'll have enough for a book. And then it was, wow, I've got way too much for a book. And then I decided that making a book that thick, with 900 pages in it probably wasn't going to be a winner, so I broke it into 3 volumes, and that's the trilogy, the My Big Toe trilogy. But I learned a lot while I was writing the books, and the theory began to gel and make more and more sense to me as I put it down on paper and had to force myself to think very logically about it. And I wanted these books to be an exercise in logic, not an exercise in intuition. And that's because there's thousands of books out there that talk about the larger reality in terms of poetry, in terms of personal experience, like Bob's, in terms of personal experience, in terms of metaphors. And poetry has to be interpreted. That's the problem. Poetry is wonderful, and it says a lot in a short bit, but it has to be interpreted. So don't be bashful. Come on in. Just walk in. Find some place to sit. Yeah. You can put some chairs right up here if you like, or there's some seats on the stairs.
Is everybody okay?
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, poetry has to be interpreted. And that's the problem, because people like me, scientists and lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs and people who spend their lives with logical process can't read poetry and come up with something that we really put a lot of credibility in, because it's kind of wishy-washy. It could be interpreted dozens of ways, and we want to know what's the right way, otherwise we can't go down that path. So there was lots of on-ramps to the larger reality. Let's just call it that now. You could call it spirituality or lots of other things, but there was to consciousness experience. Lots of on-ramps, but none of them were scientific and none of them were logical, and I wanted mine to be that way because that's the way I am. It's the way I think. So it took me a while to write this and understand it. Those books are now, if you don't, I know some of you are very new to this, but those books are available on Google Books for free, and they have been since the day they were published. So they always have been on Google Books for free. What's on Google Books, though, is the very first edition, as soon as it was published, and that hasn't changed any. So it's the older first edition. Since then, I've made lots of little changes and fixed an error here and changed an is to an R and an R to an is, done that kind of thing, which makes it a little easier to read. But I've also added a little bit of science, more than I had in it before, because I knew from my own experience and the things that I could do, the things that should have been impossible. People call these the paranormal things, the things that don't have any physical explanation, normal physical explanation. That's why they're paranormal, they're outside of normal. I realized that consciousness was fundamental. Consciousness was at the core, and that this physical reality was a product of consciousness, had to be a creation of consciousness. But at the time I finished the book and published it, I didn't really know exactly how that worked. It was still a bit of a mystery, although I knew that that's the way it had to be. I'd had it out for about two and a half years when a person was asking me questions about another subject altogether, and in my mind a bell rang. The proverbial aha moment came about, and I realized that the very same principles and ideas that was my theory of consciousness, and that's really what this MBT was. My Big Toe really was a theory of consciousness more than anything else. I realized that that theory of consciousness could explain quantum mechanics in a logical, straightforward way that made it logical science, not weird science. And that was a big aha for me. I should have gotten that a lot early. I'm pretty dense. I'm a physicist. You know, if anybody can make that connection, I should have made it, and I should have made it earlier. But it wasn't obvious to me. It didn't jump out until I got this trigger that made it obvious. So then my thought was, well, if I can explain quantum mechanics logically, then what about the other big part of modern physics, and that's relativity? So I thought about that, and it only took me about a day before, maybe even less, just a few hours, and that fell into place. You see, relativity is based on the speed of light being a constant. And if you have that as an assumption going on, the speed of light is a constant, then you get special relativity with just a little algebra. It's not even advanced math. Just based on that one fact. And then once you have special relativity, you do some geometry and you get general relativity, which then includes gravity in the situation. So relativity is just based on C being a constant. And as it turned out, my work explained why C indeed had to be a constant. Couldn't be anything else. So now I was really felt like I was on a roll, right? It's don't quit while you're while you're hot. So I started looking at all the other paradoxes in physics. There's lots of them, lots of paradoxes. Just the simple fact of tunneling, where particles should be trapped, and there's no physical way they should be able to get out because the energy to get out is much smaller than the energy that's holding them in. But they get out anyway. It's called tunneling. You find particles that ought to be in a box elsewhere. Magically, they seem to teleport out of the box to someplace else. That's been around for 60, 70 years. We have electronic components called tunneling diodes that depend on it. They run in this electronic equipment we have. So it's not just an esoteric thing. It's a thing that we use all the time, this tunneling effect. The troublesome problem of where did that ball of plasma come from? That's the beginning of Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory says that you start with a ball of plasma, very high temperature, very high pressure, and at T equals 0, you let it expand. And as it expands, it cools, it forms suns, planets, and you end up with a universe. So that's the evolution of the universe, starting with a ball of plasma. But where did the ball of plasma come from? You see, science has this attitude that our physical reality is all the reality there is. Well, if that's the case, our physical reality didn't exist yet. So how did where it come from, exist from it when it hadn't started yet? So there's a problem there. Where did that ball of plasma come from? Well, my theory of consciousness explained that as well. So I went through all of these paradoxes in physics, and they all fell out, one right after the other. I had a logical explanation for them, just from the same principles that described consciousness, much of which I had derived from my experiments inside of consciousness, or as you might say, in an out-of-body state, but doing experiments there in that state. So that's kind of why a physicist ends up talking about consciousness, because it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. And I would never have figured out this theory and this physics if I hadn't been able to do the experiments in consciousness. That was a key part of it. As you see, I had lots of data points I had to fit. If you have a theory of everything, that's a theory that explains everything. All the data points, all the facts in the world, all the things that experiments have verified. You have to have a theory that can explain every one of those facts. That's what I mean by all the points. All the data points have to be explained. And if you can't explain some, and they're facts, then your theory is incomplete. And it needs to be changed or thrown out or redone. So I had a lot more points to cover than most physicists, because I had all these facts that I had generated in my study of consciousness that had to be explained, as well as all the things that I knew from physics in the physical world that had to be explained, plus all the things that maybe weren't facts, but were very solid concepts and ideas that were in the metaphysical world, things that people had known and were obvious. things that people had experienced for years and years, things that, that science had worked around the edges of, but didn't really understand. And a lot of those were things we call paranormal. Okay? Duke University, previous to my writing the book, had been working on it for like 10 years. They had a lot of data on things paranormal, and they realized that it is a fact, it exists. So I took those kinds of things in as facts as well, and to see which ones I could explain and which ones I couldn't explain. So I ended up with this theory of everything, and any theory has to be alive. It can't be, this is it, you know, there's nothing else, this is the whole thing. If you do that, then that's a belief, and you cut yourself off from ever learning anything else. So every theory has to be one that can be modified, can be changed. It has to be a living thing, so that when new data comes in that can't be, you know, that isn't explained, then either the theory does it or the theory is incomplete. So I'm constantly looking out for new data points, facts that don't have an explanation. And so far I have been able to explain all the facts I've been able to come up with. So far it holds, but I doubt that it will hold forever. I mean, it's a theory. New things will come up and there'll be new ways of looking at things, and you'll have to add something to it or maybe take something away from it or change something. That's just the way science is. Science evolves. This idea that, okay, I've got it right and it'll be this way forever, it's not a theory, it's a law. That is not the way we think anymore in science. Newton was the last one to declare laws, and of course all his laws turned out to be approximations. None of them are laws. None of them are exactly the way he says. They don't work that way. They're just approximations in certain ranges of reality. When things move relatively slowly, you know, when they're big things, when they're in the macro world, then they work pretty well. But if you really want to get into the details, they're wrong. They're not really right. So that's kind of an introduction to who I am, how I got here, and what I'm talking about. Now, one interesting thing that I should point out is physics is kind of boring, right, to most people. If you're not a physicist, it's like, oh, really, physics? We're going to listen to that for 3 hours? No, I wouldn't put you through that, but there are some things here besides the explanation of many of the things that used to be called paranormal. Now they're just normal, actually, from this point of view. They're not paranormal at all. One thing that's really interesting here is that my theory is based upon consciousness being an information system. And that makes sense intuitively, because what is our conscious? What are we conscious of? Well, it's what we get with our 5 senses. And what is that? It's information, right? A photon bounces off of me and goes into your, you know, lens, which focuses on your retina, which creates a little voltage pulse. Gets some electrons moving. Well, that's just data. That's information. Not only that, it's discrete information. Photons are discrete. Little pulses of, you know, of electricity are discrete. So it's digital information. Digital meaning discrete chunks, not continuous. Okay. So consciousness is a digital information system. It's all about information. And 15 years ago, when these books first came out, myself and maybe 2 or 3 other people thought the idea that our reality was based on information, you know, 2 or 3 of us thought that was a good idea, really made sense, and everybody else thought we were crazy, that was ridiculous. Because when you base a reality on information, that's called a virtual reality, a computed reality. They're all one and the same thing. So say, hey, this is a virtual reality, just like those games you play. You know, this body's just your avatar, and you're a piece of consciousness. That's like, what? You got to be kidding. Well, 15 years ago, that wasn't taken seriously. Today, I'd say every physics department on the planet has probably, 20, 30% of people who think virtual reality is really a good idea. And it's not because it's becoming a fad, it's because understanding this reality as information-based is the only thing that allows physicists to get right answers. If they assume that it's mass-based, particle-based, they can't get the right answers. But if they assume that it's information-based, then it suddenly makes sense. So physicists are being drugged kicking and screaming to this idea that this is a virtual reality. They don't like that. And the whole reason they don't like it is the reason that I like it a whole lot. And that probably most of you will like it a whole lot. Okay, here's the way the logic goes. If this is a virtual reality, then there's a few logical things we can say about it. Things that are true of all virtual realities. Any virtual reality has these properties. One property is that the computer that computes the virtual reality can't reside inside the virtual reality. Right? Think about that. If you're playing World of Warcraft, the computer that's generating World of Warcraft can't be a part of the World of Warcraft game. The computer that generates it has to be in another reality outside of that game because it's creating the game, right? So it can't be created from inside. Now, another thing is that a virtual character that's going to play in this virtual reality, we call them avatars, okay? That avatar is just a computed thing. It's ones and zeros on a hard drive someplace. It's a dynamic game. Those ones and zeros are constantly changing, but that's all it is. It's just information on a hard drive. Okay? Information on a hard drive doesn't make choices. Information on a hard drive isn't conscious. Information on a hard drive is just a bunch of ones and zeros stuck in storage somewhere. Just like your Word document. Your Word document isn't conscious for the same reason. It's a bunch of ones and zeros stuck on a hard drive someplace. So that tells you that the consciousness that is making the choices for that avatar has to also be outside the virtual reality. It can't just be part of the ones and zeros. Okay. Now that makes sense in that think about World of Warcraft or Sims or some other virtual reality game you play. The player is the consciousness for the avatar. The player makes all the avatar's choices. The player says, elf, run, elf, fight, elf, jump, elf, dance, whatever he wants his elf to do, the player has to make that choice, and the player then sends a message to the computer and says, I want my elf to jump. The computer then changes the ones and zeros, it gives you a picture of an elf jumping. Okay? And all the consequences of that elf jumping based on other players and the things they're doing and the environment and so on. Okay? That's the way the game's played. So the player is the consciousness. The player can't be inside the game. If you're inside the game's where the virtual things are. So the player has to be also in another reality frame relative to the virtual reality. Can't be inside the virtual, it has to be outside the virtual reality. The player has to be in the same reality as the computer because the player and the computer are sending data back and forth. That's what virtual reality is all about. It's really a stream of data going between a player and a computer. So they have to be in the same reality. So what does that tell us about us? We have physical bodies that are avatars. The computer and the player, our consciousness, is non-physical to us. It has to be some other reality outside of this virtual reality that we're playing in. So that's just a fact of virtual reality. You can't have a virtual reality and not have that being the case. It's the nature of virtual reality. So that brings us to the point then of these 20-30% of these physicists think virtual reality is a good idea. All the experiments they're doing these days in quantum mechanics say this is an information-based reality. This is a virtual reality. What's that saying? That's saying that the scientists are coming to the conclusion that our physical world is a subset of something bigger, something more fundamental, and that something that's bigger and more fundamental is non-physical to us from our perspective from inside the virtual reality. Well, that's kind of a big statement, you see. So now we have physics that's spilling out over into philosophy and metaphysics and all sorts of things with very powerful statement about the nature of reality. That's significant. So it's not just physics, but it's saying something that's pretty strong that will make a lot of difference, because you see, in the old days, the high priests were religious people. Today, the high priests are the scientists. High priests are the people that tell everybody else what to believe and what's true and what isn't. So the scientists say, oh, that's not true, this is true. Everybody nods and goes, uh-huh, because we believe those scientists wouldn't say that if it wasn't true, because they're scientists. We believe them, just like they used to believe the priests wouldn't say that if it wasn't true, because they're priests. So scientists are the high priests of Western culture. And when the high priests stand up and say, yea, verily, there is something more fundamental than us, and we're a subset of it. It's more fundamental than us, and it's non-physical. That's going to be really a strange day when the scientists stay up and say that, isn't it? Because there's a couple of more logical pieces that I can attach to that make it even more powerful. The second piece is that because what animates a character isn't the physical stuff, it's not the action, it's not the environment. What animates the character is the character's choices, right? It's the character's choices is what makes the character do what it does. Those choices are consciousness. So that tells you who the player is, the player's consciousness. That tells you who the computer is. The computer is consciousness. So the player and the computer are all part of this same larger consciousness system. It's all consciousness. So we have a subset of this larger conscious system that serves as a computer, a subset of this larger conscious system that serves as what I call individuated units of consciousness. That would be us, the players. Basically, pieces of that larger conscious system that it created to help it evolve. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that evolution, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I have one point I'm getting at here that I'd like to make first, because it'll create a lot of questions. So I'll make sure we won't run out. Okay, so if you're following with me so far, we have consciousness as a information system that's digital, and we have us, the players, as pieces of that consciousness, right? That are part of digital consciousness, and we have our bodies and our universe and our world as a virtual reality. Okay, now the question is, well, why? What is this about? Well, given that our reality is really information-based, and that information is really the only thing that's real, if you didn't have your five senses, what would you be? You'd be a point of consciousness floating in a black void. That's all you'd be. The Descartes moment, right? I think, therefore I am. I am, therefore I think. You see, I exist, therefore I'm conscious. So that's all you'd have, nothing more than that. So our world, our reality is created from data, from information. So this information system, like all information systems, has to evolve and grow by lowering its entropy. Now, entropy is a physics word. It's just simply a measure of disorder. High entropy, lots of disorder. Low entropy, little disorder. Okay, now, an information system is made up of bits. A bit is just a name for the smallest unit of information. Now, in our computer processes, that's a 1 and a 0. Okay, we call it a binary bit. But bits don't have to be binary. That's just probably the bottom level of the way you can do things. So we can think of it now just as 1s and 0s. That's bit. Well, if you have a system of information and all those bits, every bit it has is random, then there is no information, right? Random bits don't contain any information. They don't mean anything because they're random. That's the definition of random. So how does an information system evolve? How does it exist? It exists by creating order out of disorder, by creating content. Content and meaning is just order and structure. Okay? Any kind of order produces information, even just simple little orders. And here's a little example. Up, down, up, down, up, down. What's next? Up. How'd you know that? Because the pattern carries information. See? It's a structure. It carries information. So information systems evolve by decreasing the entropy of the system. Creating order in an information system means creating information. Constructing, building. And that information needs to be valuable, needs to mean something, needs to be useful. Okay. Just a bunch of random structures are a little lower entropy, but it doesn't evolve you very much. So you have to have meaningful structures, content, significance. That's what a system wants to create. So here's an information system, and if it can evolve itself, it's getting more and more order, more and more information. As it de-evolves, it's getting less. It's getting more randomness, less information. So if this information system is conscious, it's a matter of life or death. If the information system becomes totally random, then it dies. It doesn't have any information anymore. So it wants to continue on, building. It's aware. It's consciousness. Okay, so I'm starting now with an assumption. The assumption is consciousness exists. Simple assumption. Not a real wild one, because we all think, we're conscious. So it seems like that's a good place to start, that consciousness exists. So it evolved by creating patterns of patterns, and it got kind of bogged down after a while. It got all the kind of patterns it could think about, and patterns of the patterns, and it came up with a new technology. And the new technology was called time. Now, it had always had time in a kind of a primordial sense, because you can't have order at a time without the time, because it was before the order and after the order. You change something. There's always a before and after, which requires time. So there's always some sort of time there. That's another assumption. Okay. Now, what it did is simply took two of those bits, a 1 and a 0, and just alternated them. 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and it just built a metronome. That's a clock. So now it had a clock. So with clock, that's the new technology. Now it can have sequences of patterns. Now you got a whole new dimension in which it could create and produce order, because it could produce both order, in time, as well as the order it was producing. So it also worked that out until that kind of got stalled. Like all of these inventions, it kind of creates new things you can do, more order, more ways that you can organize things. Okay, but eventually you kind of work out that, and it needed to do something else to help it continue to evolve. And like other systems that we know of, it did the exact same thing that other systems do when they run into the same problem. What it did is it created pieces of itself that it could interact with, because it was a monolithic thing trying to evolve. It had only a certain limited number of possibilities to evolve into, certain ways that it could organize. But if it had another thing like itself that also had free will, and I've just introduced free will, okay, then who knows what would happen out of that? Now you got two things that are independent, that can interact with each other. A whole bunch of new possibilities arise. Well, if it's that way with two, what about if there were 1 million and they were all interacting with each other? Wow, think of all the possibilities you could have with all of that interaction. How many ways could that go together? What are the combinations and permutations of possibilities among millions of things with free will? It's pretty much unlimited, you see. So now it had room to evolve into. And we are one of those individuated units of consciousness, one of those pieces. And we have free will. So free will, consciousness, time, all go together. They're all logically necessary for each other. You see, consciousness does what? It has awareness, but it makes choices. That's what consciousness does. It makes choices. Well, if you make a choice, you have to have time because it's before you made the choice and after you made the choice, so time's necessary. And you need free will because otherwise there is no choice. Free will says that there is a choice. Determinism says there is no choice. So consciousness, free will, and time all kind of go together as a group of things that are necessarily logical for each other to exist. And down on the other side of that, in the opposite corner, is where most science is today, and that is there is no time. Time is an illusion. There is no consciousness. There is no free will. You have determinism instead of free will. And if you are a materialist, you have to be in that camp. Materialism cannot exist as a concept without determinism. It also comes to the conclusion that there is no time. Time has to be an illusion, and there is no free will. There is no choice. Everything's a big machine. Materialism has it, our reality is just this big machine. If you knew where all the piece parts were, and you knew what state they were all in, their velocity, their size, all the things about all the parts, then you could calculate everything that would ever happen from there on, because it's just this machine that obeys the rules. You can't have free will. Nobody's making any choices. Everything happens because it's just the way the machine works. So, you see, determinism means that you have to have determinism if you have a machine. And time becomes a problem in a machine as well. And that gets more into relativity theory, but time does become a problem in this machine because everything that's possible to happen needs to happen. And I guess that turns into many worlds theory, which we'll maybe get into later if you want to talk about it. So we have these two opposite ends, the free will, the consciousness, and the time, no free will, no consciousness. Okay, so scientists would tell you that there's only the illusion of consciousness, the illusion of time, and the illusion of free will. They're all illusions. And the reason why they say that is because they're materialists. And any other answer would wreck materialism. So they don't say that because it makes sense. None of those things make sense. We're conscious. There is no consciousness. It's just an illusion. There is no time. Well, we recognize time. We recognize choice. We recognize consciousness every day in our life. So to deny that any of them exist takes a lot of gall, I guess. It takes a lot of belief to say things like that. But you have to if you're going to see this as a material world, see the world as a machine. All right, so my thought is that when the scientists finally get the virtual reality thing and the 20% grows to 80%, and most everybody's on board with that because it's the only thing that works, then somebody's going to ask, well, where's this virtual reality come from? Okay, we're part of a virtual reality, and there's somewhere it has to be computed, and somewhere, you have to have the consciousness that runs it, and where is that stuff? And of course, it's all non-physical. And it's only logical that the computer is consciousness. So consciousness is the computer. That's the answer to that one. Consciousness is the player. But what that tells us is one last logical point about this virtual reality. Consciousness now is a social system. In this virtual reality, you have a whole bunch of individuated units of consciousness that are playing this game together. It's a social system. And even if they're not logged into this virtual reality, consciousness just interact. They swap data. That's all they do. They communicate. They make choices. That's it. That's the function of consciousness is as the choice maker. How do you optimize being for an information system, how do you lower the entropy? How do you evolve the system if it's a social system? Now we've got these millions of individuated units of consciousness. We'll look at all the ways that social systems can interact with each other, and there's two primary paths that you can take. One of them lowers entropy, which means the system evolves and lives. The other one increases entropy, which means the system is de-evolving, moving toward death. Okay. These two systems, well, maybe I'll give you a little example. Here's an example. Let's take individuated units of consciousness. We'll take 10,000 of them and we'll put them in here in group A. Another 10,000, we'll put them here in group B. They're all basically the same. One group exactly like the other one as far as their capabilities, what they know, what they don't know, and we're going to give each group identical resources. And then we're just going to let them interact, let them go and see where they go. Okay, and you'll have the one group I'll call the love group. The other I'll call the fear group, because that's the fundamental ethic that they have. Okay, in the love group, they care about other, not about themselves. So in that group, they have resources, certain numbers of individuals. They need, what they will do is that they will try to optimize it for everybody. Because that's the love group, they care about other. They're not going to optimize it for themselves, they're going to try to optimize it for everybody. Well, everybody's trying to optimize it for everybody else. That means if you come up with a really good idea, some invention, you tell everybody, you share it, because everybody can use it. If you, find some resource that you didn't know, that you just discovered, you share it with everybody, because everybody can use it. You see, you help each other. You know, this guy's barn burns down, everybody's neighbors come together and help him build it back up. That's the kind of world you have. It's an interactive, everybody trying to be helpful to everybody else. That's what love is about. It's about other. On the fear side, well, if you have fear, you don't have trust. You can't trust, if you have fear, because you fear that person that you trust is going to stab you in the back. They're not worthy of your trust. So there's no trust on this side. And what happens is that everybody's out for themselves. So everybody grabs as much as they can grab, and they try to hold on to it. Holding on to it's a problem. Those other ones will grab everything they can grab, and then they'll come and take yours. So the big problem is, how do you hold on to it? Well, you hold on to it by being bigger or better than those other people, so it's very competitive. You hold on to it by forming groups up. Okay, here's a self-protection group. We're going to all group together and we're going to protect each other's stuff. It's still all about us, but we are going to cooperate just as a protection group. So now we can go out and take other people's stuff, because there's 10 of us and the rest of them haven't figured this out yet. So we can take everybody else's stuff, you see, and make them part of our group maybe. If they don't want to be part of our group, we can just do away with them. We don't need them. So eventually what happens is, in this fear group, it breaks up into cliques and groups that are competing power bases, ostensibly to protect themselves from the other groups, but actually they're also preying on the other groups to take their stuff. And it develops and grows and evolves that way, and eventually you end up with, of course, these groups are going to be very hierarchical, because that's the way it works in fear. You're going to have to depend on somebody, but you don't want to depend on too many. You're going to have lots of people looking for other people, and everybody's ratting on everybody else, and you're going to have a lot of hierarchy here. A lot of control mechanisms is why you need a hierarchy, to control people that you really don't trust. So you end up, at the end of this, with 3% of the beings over here in the fear group owning 98% of all the resources, and everybody else is in the hierarchy with all the peons on the bottom. Nobody trusts everybody. Everybody's out for themselves, trying to get along the best they can. Sounds like where we live, doesn't it? That's how our life is. Okay, over here in this group A, the love group, they have completely optimized the resources and the people in an effort to make everybody have as much free will, as much choice, as much ability, as much potential, get everybody's potential developed out to the capacity of that potential. That's how you optimize. So you see the difference between these two groups. One of them's like where we live, the other one's like where we'd like to live. Okay, so what does that tell us about social groups? If you have social groups interacting, what's the side that's evolving, lowering entropy? And what's the side that's raising entropy? The love side lowers entropy, moves toward love. The fear side increases entropy. It's self-defeating, it's self-destructive, it's not sustainable. So not only do we have scientists saying that there's something bigger than us that's non-physical, and consciousness is the computer, but that love is the purpose. We're here to evolve to become love. So why would this information system create this virtual reality for individuated units of consciousness to play in? Because this is a entropy reduction trainer simulation. We log on here to play this game because of the choices we make. See, we have choices here. Well, why did you need the virtual reality to begin with? Well, when we were just communicating with each other, think of it as a big chat room. You got millions of conscious, and all they do is just communicate with each other because you don't have much of a rule set. The only rules you have there are the rules that define communication. That's it. What are the consequences? Almost none. What are the issues? What are the dilemmas? Almost none. So there's not a lot of choice. And the choices don't drive you to, toward fear or toward love. They're just kind of bland. Well, you can evolve in that environment, but very, very, very slowly. A virtual reality with a tight rule set, a rule set that defines all energy exchanges such that you do something that affects somebody else. And what they do affects you. We all affect each other. We're all connected in this by this rule set of how we all interact and affect each other. You see, that is a game with consequences. You come here and you make choices and it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. If you make good choices, you end up being a happy camper. Your life is full of joy. Things work really well for you. You make poor choices, you end up miserable, struggling, full of fear, and not such a happy camper. So there's incentive here as well as choice. So now we get to what is this virtual reality? What does it mean when the scientists say this is a virtual reality and they agree that that is the right answer? It not only means that there's something that's the higher power, if you will, the more fundamental thing that's non-physical, that we aren't really bodies, we're a piece of consciousness, makes us immortal, that's interesting. We don't die as a physical body dies, but besides that, we have a purpose and a mission here, and that's to become love, to make choices to help the system evolve rather than make choices to help the system de-evolve. And as much as we are pieces of that system, the system wants to help us as much as it can because it wants us to succeed. That's why it made this neat virtual reality entropy reduction trainer for us to play in so we could make choices that matter and grow from those choices because we get consequences. So that is a rather big statement for the high priest of science to say to the world. There's something more powerful, non-physical, and the whole reason we're here is to become love. Think if that idea became a common idea across the population. That would make a big difference. So you see, it's not just about physics. It is about physics, but that's not the only thing. And just one last comment, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to fix some electronics. And that is that theories don't get much traction among other scientists unless they have experimental evidence. So last October of 2016, I presented a whole set of there's like 17 experiments, all quantum mechanics experiments. And they're in 5 groups. If you want to read about them and have them described to you, you can go to Google, and not Google, you can go to YouTube, and on YouTube, look up, do a search for, get on my site, my channel, YouTube, and search for MBT, as in my big toe, hyphen LA, because I did these in Los Angeles, is where I gave the talk. And you'll find a whole talk that explains all these experiments. So now these experiments are out there, and these experiments, if they turn out the way I have predicted, will demonstrate, give very strong evidence for this being a virtual reality, consciousness being the computer. So there we have it. And we're in the process of getting these experiments done now. Matter of fact, in another 2 weeks, we're going to start a Kickstarter program to help fund them to get them started, because we thought, well, we just take them to universities and they'd be glad to get them. But it doesn't work like that. They're busy. You know, you can't say, hey, stop everything you're doing and work for free. Nobody likes that in their job. So we're trying to get some funding to make this work. So this is not just theory, but it's also experimental physics. And we've got the experiments that will probably be done within a year or so. I think we'll get close. If this thing works, then we'll have them done we'll start on them maybe within 6 months or so. So that is kind of who I am and why I'm here, because the more people that understand that love is the answer, the more likely we'll do this right when the high priests of Western culture stand up and say this is a virtual reality. Otherwise, we might end up in a food fight. You know, this is a virtual reality. Oh, my God's a better programmer than your God. You know, we don't want to get into that. We don't want to go back to, you know, religious wars of whose God's a better programmer. So this virtual reality was not programmed. Virtual reality just evolved, not programmed. And we can talk all about that later, but now we're going to take a break.